Hello, this is Samuel McNair with Truth and Reason, and in this video I wanted to continue to talk about different ways of starting gospel conversations, and this is actually part 2, and a couple of months ago I did a part 1, and I talked about how to start gospel conversations using props, and I gave an example of being in a taxi cab with a driver who had a Buddhist temple on his dashboard. And I asked him what that was on his dashboard, and he said it was a Buddhist temple. And I asked him if he followed Buddhism, and I asked if he was going to go to Nirvana, and what was the point of him following Buddhism. And it started off a spiritual conversation in which I got to talk to him about Jesus and his miracles and what it means to trust in Jesus Christ. And in this part, I want to talk about a way to start gospel conversations that we all know what it is. We've all seen it. We've all heard about it. But I think many of us are a little bit timid in using this way, even though I believe God has used it very much and he still continues to use it. And I think it's a little bit underemphasized. So my hope in this video is to encourage you in this, or to at least kind of open you up a little bit to it so that you may encourage others or try it for yourself if you've never ever tried it before. And that method, and it's actually one of my favorites, is walking up to a stranger or opening up the conversation with anyone, a family member, a stranger, a coworker, and asking them, "Are you going to heaven?" Just out of the blue, abruptly, immediately, in order to swing over to the spiritual conversation. And I usually go to the mall in my hometown to share the gospel. And what I like to do is I like to just walk up to strangers who are sitting on a bench, and I say, "Hello, my name is Samuel, and I'm with a local church in town. I'm with a local church, and I'm just asking people the question, are you going to heaven?" And the reason why I ask that question is because it gets me directly into a spiritual conversation immediately. I'm not talking about their dog. I'm not talking about their kids. I'm not talking about their job. That might come up in the conversation or at the end of it. But immediately, I want to share the gospel. I want to have a spiritual conversation with the person so that at the end, they know who Jesus is, what he did, and how they are to put their trust in him. And it just gets immediately right to the heart of the issue. And from my experience, God has used this many times to encourage me and to encourage and challenge other people. And I've even seen people who have just come under conviction as God has used that question and he's allowed me to get into conversation. And you may ask, okay, but how is this biblically backed, or how did Jesus ever model this? And in one of the areas in which Jesus modeled this is John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. He came up and he asked her for a drink, and she said, "Well, you're a Jewish guy asking me for a drink." And then he said, "If you knew who it was talking to you, you would have asked him, and he would give you living water." And he just immediately just took that pivot to the spiritual after just breaking the ice with water. And that's what I'm talking about here. Just break the ice. You can say, "Hello, my name is so-and-so." Or you can say to someone that you already know, "Hey, can I ask you an important question? Are you going to heaven?" And yeah, this might produce some kind of shock. This might cause someone to just be like, "Whoa, what are you talking about?" But that's actually a good thing. As I mentioned in one of my other videos that I'm going to post a link to under this. But there are also other Christian ministers of the past who've been very successful, who have actually talked about this being a viable question to ask someone when you're wanting to share the gospel. And one of those ministers of the past, if you ever get a chance to read some of his writings, is R.A. Torrey. And in his book, How to Work for Christ, he talks about that. And I just want to read one of his quotes very briefly. He says in chapter 4 on how to begin to start a spiritual conversation, he says, "Sometimes It is well to begin in this direct way, even when you meet someone casually. The question, are you saved, is as a general rule a better one to ask than are you a Christian? It is more likely to set one thinking. It is more definite and pointed. Many will take the asking of such a question as an impertinence, but that will not prove that the question has not done good. Not a few people have become angry at a stranger putting a question like this to them, have afterward become converted as a consequence of it. So some people might find this annoying or they might find it a little antagonistic, but listen to what he says again. He says, not a few people who have become angry at a stranger putting a question like this to them have afterward been converted in consequence of it. So even though some people might find this annoying, they might get a little bit offended, he says that people have gotten saved off this question. So my hope is we would even see this and say, man, this really is a viable way. If I see a stranger at a bus stop or under a street light smoking a cigarette or waiting for a bus, I have the confidence to walk up to him and introduce myself and say, excuse me, can I ask you a question? Are you going to heaven? Or another variation can be, I'm just asking people the question, do you believe in an afterlife? And I can have confidence that God might use this. In another book called The Fight of Faith, which is a biography by a man, about a man named Uncle John Vassar, written by a pastor who served with him. And Uncle John Vassar was an evangelist in the 19th century. And I'm going to just read something briefly about him and his evangelistic method, which very much mirrors this one. So in his introduction on page 11, it says, the pastor says this about him. He says, what always struck me as most remarkable in his personal conversations was their absolute abruptness. In scores of interviews of the sort which I have witnessed, I never once remember his introducing his subject with any preliminary remarks. Did you get that? That means this pastor doesn't remember the evangelist, Uncle John Vassar, ever getting into small talk with the person that he wants to share the gospel with. He would just walk up to them and say, excuse me, sir, or excuse me, ma'am, do you love Jesus? Have you been born again? Are you saved? This man would literally go to a bunch of doors in a town. He would knock on every door and he would say, excuse me, are you born again? And he would cause an uproar. But what this would do was it would get people out of their complacency and out of their prejudice and cause them to really think about what he was asking, or to go and talk to someone else who would then follow up with that conversation. So he was opening closed hearts by his spiritual census taking. But I'll continue to read. It says, he came at once to the theme. His first question after the ordinary salutation was generally the vital question. My friend, will you kindly permit me to ask you, have you been born again? And the pastor continues on to say, this method I think he adopted deliberately, as having been proved by years of experience the wisest. Noticing the shock and revulsion which this abrupt approach sometimes produced, I used to regret that he was not more circuitous in his advances. But I confess that with larger experience I have changed my mind and come to the conclusion that this directness is one of the most vital conditions of success in personal conversation. So this pastor was actually timid about this direct approach, but then after evaluating it and thinking about it, he came to the conclusion that this is actually vital for success. To directly come at someone's heart and ask, are you going to heaven? How is your relationship with God? Any kind of spiritual question, to get in that conversation is vital for success. God uses it. Even though it might cause some kind of shock or revulsion, that might be necessary. Okay, that might be necessary for the person who has not thought about eternity for years. They're focused on their own life. They're focused on their job. They're focused on their family, but they're not right with God. They're not on their way to heaven. They don't know God. And they need someone to come in and say, are you going to heaven? So this is just another way to get into conversation. And I talked about 10 minutes about it because it's my favorite and I've used this the most out of any other method or any other way to get into conversation. So might I encourage you, if you haven't shared the gospel in a long time, try it with your neighbor, with your coworker on break, with someone at a gas station, at the mall, at a bus stop. Just ask them, hey, how are you doing today? My name is so and so, and I just would like to ask you a question. Are you going to heaven? Do you believe in any sort of afterlife? And just watch what God does. Watch to see if they haven't been thinking about spiritual things, or if they were wondering, man, if they were wondering about spiritual things before you ask them. And just to close, I remember one time I was at the University of Florida campus and I just saw a guy on a bench um, just sitting there reading something. And I walked up to him and I asked him the question, are you going to heaven? And someone behind me on a bike hears me ask that question and he stops and he listens to my conversation with this other guy. And then afterwards, I turn around to talk to this guy, and he says, I was actually riding around campus to find someone to talk to about spiritual things, and I got to witness to him. I got to share the gospel with him because I just simply stepped out in faith and asked this direct question. So don't be afraid, be direct. I do these videos because I'm afraid and I don't like to be direct. I'm introverted, but God uses it. God wants to use it, and He will. So check out the links below the video for my other conversations or my other videos about getting into conversation about the gospel. Have a great night. Bye.